Cool. I am coming off of a cold. I still have a very light fever. Uh, it's 10:20 here, which means that on the East Coast where I'm used to, it's 12:20 midnight. I just saw John Wick 3, and let's talk about it. I think I'm gonna go in this video until my voice gives out. I want to talk about John Wick as a series, and specifically 3, in regards to Every Frame of Painting's Jackie Chan video essay. I'll link to that in the Dooblydoo. I already started a Twitter thread on this, but I want to talk more specifics about John Wick 3, more than I think a Twitter thread would be good for right now. Don't want to accidentally put on spoilers that anyone might not want. So I'm going to first start going over what I talked about in the Twitter thread, which is non-spoiler things for John Wick 3, but we'll go over some stuff in John Wick 1 and 2, but basically you should see all of them because they're good action movies. And good movies. That's not a distinction that I think needs making. So especially when John Wick 2 was about to come out, there was this video that went kind of viral of Keanu Reeves doing some of his training, where he basically was just being John Wick, except to little cardboard standees as opposed to real people. Which, it's good that it's not real people, and it's cool that, he can do all of this stuff. But it's this idea of sort of genuineness, in that here we have an actor who is not having to need a stunt double in order to do all of these things. If I remember right, movies with Mikey and Patrick Willems' 2-part Mission Impossible series also talked a little bit about this. I'll link, of course, both of those also in the Dooblydoo. Movies with Mikey's 2 videos on John Wick are also quite good. Basically, a lot of people have talked about these movies because they're recent, have been very good, and there's a lot of stuff to talk about with them. But I think it's worth putting them in context with Jackie Chan, and specifically the lessons that I think Jackie Chan does abide by, and that Every Frame of Painting lays out very clearly in terms of what makes good action comedy, because I don't think that those two are very separate. It's just which parts are you're putting more emphasis on the action and more emphasis on the comedy. And I'll get to that in a moment. To oversimplify the Every Frame of Painting, the basic parts of it are: you want to start out the fight as an underdog, you want to use your surroundings for very unique action, and you want to make sure that we, the audience, see how cool the action is. You don't want to obfuscate it with too much stuff in the foreground. You don't want it to be too flashy that we can't see what's happening, but you don't want it to be too dark that we can't see what's happening. You want to sort of lay it out plain so we understand how cool the things that are being done are. In order to do that, then we have to understand what it is that is actually being done. John Wick is really good at this. Again, the recent Mission Impossible movies are very good at this, and Jackie Chan's movies are phenomenal at this. If you don't know, Jackie Chan is a director, or at the very least has been in his life. To say was sounds dismissive of past events, but he, at the very least, has been a director, and nobody directs Jackie Chan like Jackie Chan. He's phenomenal at it. But it's all pretty well summarized by a pretty famous Jackie line. I said I don't want trouble. This idea that you as the audience know that some shit's about to go down, but it's not like the person who's doing all the shit is the instigator. Instead, they're the ones who are being brought into the fight. They just have to sort of see it through and see it out, and they will do so with some level of brutality. Man. Sorry, all of these movies are just so good, and I just love thinking about them. So if you think of John Wick's first act, the unrelated death of the wife, the then interrelated death of the dog, this is the most masterclass shorthand version of I don't want no trouble. This is someone being brought back in. John Wick is the underdog throughout the entirety of it because the beginning has essentially built up so much goodwill that any brutalities he does throughout the rest of it, the kinds of things that edgelords would be like, oh, this protagonist is actually super bad because of all of this brutal bad stuff he does. The kind of thing where at the end of Uncharted 2, the bad guy says, "Oh, you call me the bad guy. Look at how many people you have killed." And it's like, oh yeah, we get it, but that's what the game has set up. We can accept that more readily because the movie has shown us sort of how from underneath John is coming, which is why 2 kind of lost me a little bit, because the dog had, in addition to being just like the best puppy ever, the dog had other symbolic resonance than just something that John owned. This was the last gift from a now deceased loved one who recognized that John would be lost otherwise, and the movies with Mikey goes into this a little bit as well. But when it comes to John Wick 2, John Wick 1 already used pretty much all of that. I'll call it goodwill, and instead blows up the house and like builds what feels to me like contrived rules in a previously sort of elegantly simple expanded universe past the barriers of what we see in John's world. And like the action is really good, and the action I think follows very well the principles set up in the other facets of Police Story, of using a lot of environmental pieces. I think that the subway fight where John Wick and essentially his counterpart are trying to be very subtle and sly and shooting across from each other, as well as the underground cave fight where the ammo reloads that have been placed down before are so carefully used. And then further with that, the John Wick only having, 7 bullets, and having to do things with that. I think that all of those pieces are establishing good rules that push John at specific disadvantages, and we see him overcome those disadvantages in really, really great ways. And we see him overcome those disadvantages. We see the action happen, and we see the thought processes, and we see the precision. One thing that surprised me when I rewatched John Wick 1 very recently, and that I took note of in watching John Wick 3, the action doesn't feel slower, but it is very much shot and acted slower because there aren't cuts away so much. These are people actually doing these actions who are trained to do these actions so they can perform them at a way that is not just realistic, but realistic to a degree that feels faster than it perhaps actually is. One of the best recurring bits in John Wick is when John is like holding down someone and then tries to shoot him, but then is out of bullets, and so has to like hold him down while reloading, and then shoots them. I think this connects to 2 pieces. Calling it a bit connects to Jackie Chan in that there is humor to be derived from this. You can frame this as both humorous or tense and suspenseful, and I think John Wick does both, and I think Jackie Chan movies do both. But also, there's this pace to the fights that is feels more unique to John Wick than to other gun fu movies, where the deliberateness of the actions builds perhaps a slower pace, but not too slow that it's like a Western where it's so drawn out and then very punctuated by action, but rather the action scenes themselves are so numerous that they can't just be drawn out in between them, but the action itself is a little more slowed down. So we can clearly see all of the action. We can clearly see the specific points of contact and injury, as well as sort of getting the surroundings in the way that John sees them. Especially in John Wick 1, I can't think of any times of sort of dramatic tension where we know more than John does, except for perhaps the presence of Miss Perkins. And that is sort of diffused by us also knowing that Marcus is right there. And there's tension in that scene in John Wick 1 with not knowing exactly which side Marcus is going to be on. We, for the most part, know all of the pieces that John does, because the action sort of is just slow enough to take the time to bring us along with it. The extra time is used to let us see how cool everything is. John Wick 3, I think, did a better job of environmental pieces. John Wick 2 had the pencil thing where, he kills a bunch of people with a pencil, paying off something. In John Wick 1, the line where the big boss man is like, oh, he killed someone with a pencil, ooh. But I think that 3 did it better in, one scene where we can tell that sort of there's not going to be action right that instant, that the people who John is going to see ask him to remove his belt, and he removes his belt. And then later on, we see him take off his belt and use it as a weapon in really cool and innovative ways. Innovative, what do I know? I don't fight. But it feels like a much more setup and payoff in the one piece of narrative, as opposed to the, we used that thing before, let's take it in for this one, and the audience will like that. It feels more like a setup and a payoff than trying to get sort of audience brownie points. But back to how action comedy and action and I guess comedy all sort of interrelate in the same ways. Every Frame a Painting has a great video on Edgar Wright, which I think goes into the comedy side of it, and you can see a lot of the same kinds of principles used from the Jackie Chan stuff in the Edgar Wright comedy bits, more so using the specific pieces of the frame itself as opposed to environmental things, but definitely also with use of environmental elements. Specifically, I'm thinking of End of the World. Is that one? Is that what that one's called? The third of the Cornetto trilogy, with the drinks and the use of that for comedic effect through the visual language. But when thinking of action as either action comedy or pure action through the amount of tension that you use, that you frame it through, I think then you can really see the similarities between John Wick and Jackie Chan. Because when you watch Police Story, at least when I watch Police Story, by the time you get to the end of it, you don't think about the comedy as much, because you're so wrapped up in the story and in the action and in the tension that way, that you just see the action and you see essentially the brutality and you see the numbers of windows that are being bashed through by all sorts of people. And there's an element of comedy to it, but there's also just this element of action tension. I think that you can really see the difference in this by watching the movie all the way through versus watching the Every Frame a Painting, because some of the Every Frame a Painting stuff is, because it's edited in sequence, it's edited without the sort of broader context of the narrative, it seems a lot funnier than it feels when you're watching it just as a whole narrative, because you're getting these individual pieces which can feel either like gags or like pieces of action. Early on in the Every Frame a Painting, Jackie Chan throws someone between the two sort of escalator rails, and he kind of slides down. And watching that in the video, I say, it's funny. He's like, oh wow, he's just all squinched up between these two. But watching it in the movie, it's like, whoa, that's so cool. Oh, he got him right between that. Oh, that must hurt. But they're one and the same, just how you frame it. I'm going to go back to the example of the having to reload the gun. In John Wick 2, I think it's used once, possibly twice, and there it is very much a humorous thing. John Wick is so overpowered that even when he runs out of bullets, then he still has time to reload. And in John Wick 3, it's used a couple of times, and I think it's used once for a very comedic effect and once for a very tense effect. The second time with a lot more tension, because here we have people who are essentially bullet sponges. They have super armor, and John has to shoot him a bunch more times, and as usual, just like shoot him a couple times to get a headshot just doesn't work on them because they got just so much armor. It feels very video gamey. I'll get back to that in a moment as well. But there, it's like, oh, now like the time pressure is really significant because there's people all around, and John can't just take them out as easy. He has to like really be even more tactical about the way he goes about it. Previously, it's again a situation where it is John is so overpowered that, he could even take the time to do this. But again, I don't think it's exclusively either time. I think that it functions as both, depending on where you as an audience are standing with it. But either way, it's just good. Because either you're drawing enjoyment out of it from the tension of the action and, oh, what's going to happen next? Or you're drawing enjoyment from it in, oh, this is like funny action. This is action that has comedic elements to it. One of my favorite Jackie Chan fights comes near the beginning of Police Story 2. They're in a playground. That playground fight is so good. These guys with bars come out, and Jackie Chan has to fight them. At some point, he gets a bar of his own, and he's fighting them off with that. And, he keeps getting knocked down. He keeps using the playground as an environment through which to hurt and harm them. And there's this sense of tension where, you're pretty sure everything's going to be okay, but still it's funny and still there's tension to it. You know that Jackie Chan is such an amazing fighter, but you're still drawn into the fight by the tension of it. But you still, I would say, especially because it's early enough in the movie, you still can laugh at all of the things because, someone getting pulled down through the monkey bars, that way, they get hit in the nuts and then you drag them over and then go down a slide. And like, that's funny. This element of both slapstick and action. Similarly, now one of my favorite John Wick fights is, I think, the second action scene in John Wick 3, where he's being chased by essentially these ninja guys, and he runs through this little corridor where there's a bunch of chandeliers, then he runs up some stairs, and he bursts into this room, which he then realizes has all of these like antique guns around. And he has to scrounge together. He has to find the right bullets that match this revolver, and he finds just a couple, and so he has just like 2 shots. And he does it like an old Western draw where they come through the door and goes, and it's super cool. And then they're fighting, and then he realizes, wait, we're fighting with all these just like racks of knives and axes and again, antique weaponry just like around us. And so then everyone just like starts busting the windows and getting all these weapons and going through them, and John has like 20 knives to throw at people. It's so good. It's great use of environment as weaponry while still being gun fu, because it's hard to use ladders in the same way that Jackie Chan uses ladders when you're trying to do gun fu, because where do you find just like random guns around? And John Wick does this pretty well. 2 tried to do this with, laying out the guns beforehand, and this showed a lot more of sort of the preparation on John's part, and I think that's really good. But I think the first action scene in John Wick where he finds... Does he have the gun in there? I think he has a gun inside of yes, he has a gun inside of a book. If not, then I think he has some sort of weapon in there, or he just uses the book as a weapon in of itself. That's great. And then he's in this, antique weapons collection. Then he uses all of these, and his opponents use these as well. And that part is fantastic, where he has to do the thing that he's doing better than his opponents are doing the thing that he's doing. I always like that in a story, where it's not just that one side has one thing that the other side doesn't, but that both are trying to use the same kind of power, but that good will overcome it just by the fact that it is good. I think that John Wick, at its best, does this kind of thing too, where, all the bad guys are also clamoring for knives, but John is better at just like deflecting them or taking them in strategic places, and then, or disarming them and then just throwing the knives back and then just throwing 3 more knives because there's a rack of knives right there. It's good, both action and comedy, because just before that, we have been set up to show how essentially dangerous and deadly knives and bladed weapons are. John gets a little bit stabbed in the fight beforehand, and he has to go to a doctor who, because he's excommunicado, he then has to finish up the stitching himself. And again, there's this level of tension and comedy in that scene too, where the doctor is like, listen, they're gonna know that like I didn't fully follow the excommunicado. I told you where the medicine you're looking for is. John Wick's like, but you stopped stitching right when I became excommunicado. And the doctor is like, yeah, but for safety, you just have to shoot me here. Let me prepare my suture and my disinfectant. Just shoot me right here. And then John just like, without hesitation, shoots in the exact right spot. And it's like, there's this tension of like, oh, this person who's helping him is having to face these consequences. One of the themes of the movie. As well as the comedy of just like, nope, John just did it. There's no hesitation. Wow. And the precision that that John Wick has. It's all fantastic. And so I think John Wick 3 is pretty good at having a better sort of sense of following these for its action scenes. It tries to introduce something new to every fight scene in a way that doesn't make them constantly have this kind of power creep while still allowing each one to feel like a cool, unique entity. Because there's one where now he's fighting with someone else, and that someone else has two dogs, and they're having to fight their way out of this place, and the dogs are running around and helping out tear up people, and it's really cool. Or there's this other scene where there's bulletproof glass everywhere, and there's also regular glass everywhere, and you can't quite tell which is the bulletproof and which is the non-bulletproof glass. But I think it still succumbs to this kind of power creep. You started to see this in John Wick 2, where what do you feel like is a real threat to John Wick, except for someone who feels sort of equally matched to John Wick, and you have the bodyguard out for revenge, doing that, fulfilling that role. It felt like okay, I see where this is going, and I guess this is the ride we're on. Now they have added a layer from which they need to one-up themselves. But on the whole, they've been pretty good about trying to develop a wider playing field as opposed to a taller playing field, as to developing individual scenarios in which cool individual things can happen, and they explore, if not the totality, then a wide set of things that can happen within those each individual rule sets. There's also a good essay on the action of Genndy Tartakovsky that does this, looking at Samurai Jack. I'll have to find that again, where it talks about how Genndy Tartakovsky's action thinks of the full array of ways to show an action happening. Thinking of the blind archers episode and the robot army approaching, and the robots don't just get hit with arrows the same way every time, but sort of they get hit from all sides, they get hit so then they hit each other, then there's this giant like robot tank that comes in, and then that gets blown up, and then another one gets hit in such a way that its arm goes fling to the side before it blows up, or the driver gets hit and then drives it into a bunch of other robots and then it blows up, and sort of building and exploring the possibilities of each space before putting more layers of power on top of it. But you definitely see this power creep in 3 with the the what are they called? They're like table soldiers, I'll call them. So John Wick 2 introduced these heads of the table, the people who are in charge of all the assassins, essentially the Senate or the UN or the whatever oligarchical governing wow, whatever oligarchical governing body you want to think of. Did I just call the Senate oligarchical? Nah, I don't particularly not stand by that. And so these enforcers for this table come in at the end of John Wick 3, and they have, special armor and special helmets and these, super big fancy guns. John Wick's thing of just like shooting them a couple times and then shooting them in the head just like doesn't work in the same way. Even though the helmets that they're using look exactly the same as the motorcycle helmets we've seen twice or thrice previous in the same movie. They just are the video game equivalent of bullet sponges. They just take more damage, which creates a few more interesting situations wherein John has to double and triple check that they don't just get back up again. But it feels like the power creep that video games often have. I'm going to now link to another video essay, this time by Game Maker's Toolkit, done on the enemies of Doom and how they feel so different than other shooter video game characters. Essentially the, 5 or 7 original enemies in the original Doom game each do something so drastically different from each other that, some try to come up and do melee damage, or some are big and take a lot of damage but fire very slowly, whereas in something like even Uncharted, a very, very good video game with, I would say, pretty darn good action, just ramps up how much it takes for them to die, how much armor they're wearing, essentially. You really feel this in Uncharted with, I'll say especially the Yetis in Uncharted 2, and whenever someone is carrying a Gatling gun. They're just bullet sponges which take more. And again, I'll link to that in the doobly-doo for extra context, further deep dive. It then pulls back from that and goes back into this kind of unique setting. This is where we get the action scene in the bulletproof glass versus non-bulletproof glass. In an action scene which has very few guns. In fact, there's only one handgun, and John Wick has it, immediately gets kicked away. And instead, there's a bunch of ninjas who mostly use bladed weapons. And I never thought about what a bladed weapon would look like when it smashes against bulletproof glass. But I'm sold. It looks cool. And this is also where we get John Wick finally taking out his belt and doing the cool, innovative thing with that. And so we're, again, exploring the space that this one place can do. With that, also exploring this humanity side of John Wick, because you have these two henchmen who have a very clear opportunity to kill John Wick, but instead stop and are like, help him up, and it's like, oh, we're so delighted to fight with you, like, this is such a great fight, I'm so happy to be fighting with you, what an honor, Mr. Wick. And then they fight more, and they fight more, and they fight more, and John Wick has the opportunity to kill them, and he's like, this has been good, I'll see you guys later, pretty much. We see this a little bit in John Wick 2, when he keeps the counterpart assassin alive. Kind of. Doesn't fully kill him. He doesn't sort of do the double tap in the head, confirmation he's dead kind of dealio. In terms of John Wick's humanity, one thing that I really, really liked about John Wick 1, and one thing that had me kind of conflicted about John Wick 2, that I was hoping to be sort of resolved in 3, but it seems like that resolution will have to wait, and has been further complicated by 3. One is a story about how having friends is good, pretty much. John is trying to do something very difficult that isn't exactly against the rules, but the rules aren't exactly helping him. And instead, he has a lot of friends who help him to accomplish the thing that he's doing. Marcus saves his life. What the fuck? I think someone just slammed themselves against the other side of my wall. Marcus saves... God, I'm tired. Marcus saves his life. The folks at the Continental help him. John Leguizamo's character gives him another car. John has developed a good rapport with these people, so that way they both know not to fuck with him, but also want to hang with him. Like, they want to be on his good side because they seem friends with him, not just because John Wick seems like, the baddest badass you ever did see. Because this is also a movie where very easily, if these people were against John Wick, he could be out of it. And that's something that I think John Wick 2 tries to kind of explore, where it says, okay, what happens if all of these people are then against you? What happens if the rules themselves are against you? I don't think it answers that very nicely, especially when you have all of these people who, very seemingly want to help, but, they just can't because of these rules that we just introduced. You know how it is. And 3 kind of starts to grapple with that more. The end of 2, where Winston, the manager at the New York Continental, lets him go with an hour's notice, not just comes back in that 3 is everyone is against John Wick, but also in that the movie deals with trying to talk about the consequences for your actions in a system that doesn't want you to necessarily be benevolent to other people. I'm gonna be honest, I think I'm giving this movie a little bit too much credit in terms of its theme. I think it doesn't think of things systematically so much, but I don't think it thinks about systems a non-zero amount. It's a toughie, because it definitely tries to convey some form of theme, but I think it tries to convey topics more than themes as overtly. And I think this is a movie that wouldn't exactly be hurt by trying to be a little more overt. You see John Wick 1 convey really great themes in terms of grief and essentially grief management, in even subtle ways. You have the car at the beginning where he's, he drives into the junkyard, and he's like about to just like smash his car into some big junkyard trucks, but decides not to because he has this dog, and he has to take care of and keep alive in whatever form the relationship that he had with Helen. I'm almost out of water, folks. And so 3 keeps bringing up this topic of consequences, and part of it is that it's very much setting up the continued John Wick franchise, wherein now we're going to see John Wick and Friends versus the world, and Friends really just being Lawrence Fishburne and company, and probably Halle Berry with a sort of complicated, tenuous relationship with Winston and the Continental at the end, which results in it not fully resolving its themes, when I think you can have sort of these chapters that still have themes and resolve those themes. Because if John Wick 1 was about, look at how good it is to be sort of on the edge of rules and have friends, and John Wick 2 is about, what if you're trying to break the rules, or the rules are trying to break you, and your friends aren't super helping? 3 then starting to be about, how do you choose what allegiances in the fallout from that do you follow? Which seems like that's what 4 and presumably 5 and presumably post that 6 until whenever Keanu Reeves retires are going to follow, but it didn't feel as fully resolved in this one as I would have hoped. Both Lawrence Fishburne and Winston face some kinds of repercussions for mildly helping John Wick in ways that I don't think were breaking the rules as such. Winston for giving him an hour's heads up and letting him walk away, and Lawrence Fishburne for giving him a gun. Winston has this kind of like weird playing both sides, just trying to keep his position. He essentially locks himself in a vault until all of the fighting is resolved, and then comes out and then says things to make himself on top and back in charge, and the Continental reestablished, and then lets John Wick go with plausible deniability by shooting him off of a rooftop in a fall that seemed really gratuitous. Man, John Wick 3 was like much more like gruesome and I want to say grotesque than the other 2 were. Like I'd had to avert my eyes a couple times. A dude's eyeball gets stabbed, like, and you see it from like really up close. I closed my eyes on that one. I don't like eyeball stuff happening. This one seemed to revel in its grotesqueness a little more, which became a problem at a couple of points, but overall wasn't all too different than 1 and 2. You definitely see sort of hints of that in 1 and 2, but I don't think it was sort of as overt as in this one. And I think this one, in part, dealt with, I'll say, bladed weaponry a bit more, and consequently had more opportunities for that. But Lawrence Fishburne's character essentially is like, yo, if y'all think you're bigger than me, then fucking come at me. And they do come at him, and he gets his face and body all slashed up, and he just gets cool scars and a kick-ass cane. And he's the one who takes in John Wick at the end after he's been shot off of a rooftop. He was wearing body armor, but he still fell like 6 feet. It was a wild fall, y'all. That one, I don't think was a real stunt. And so you kind of get these 2 opposing views of like, okay, here's someone who's kind of ish loyal to you, and here's someone who is like really like on your side. And the setup for this sort of waging war against the table. And so because of how action-oriented it is, I think its theme got pretty muddled, and again, because of the setup, it didn't get resolved in the same way. I don't think it has thematic resolution. I don't think it fully said what it wants to say, or even knows what it fully wants to say. That is going to explore these things through the sequels, really. And I think you see this in when John meets the Elder, the one person above the table, the assassin above all assassins, who gives John Wick a choice to either just like die right then, or to live and kill Winston. And in order to prove his fealty in that moment, has to chop off his ring finger and give the ring to the Elder, who then, in a shot that very much seems like a setup for, now we know where John has to find his ring later, just puts it in a pocket under his, like, robes. You know, that scene bummed me out because, like, it didn't seem to be framing it in a John has lost his way and John is doing the wrong thing in this moment. Only later, in a conversation with Winston, does it sort of give the idea that John had done a wrong thing in giving that up. But, you know, we gotta keep seeing more John Wick movies because, you know, they must be fun to make and they keep making money, so I'm out of water. John goes to the desert. So similar to how these movies can be framing their action as either sort of comedic or tense, they could be framing their characters as either right or wrong, and they don't seem to be doing that. This is something that they seemed to be doing really good in John Wick 1, and had a little bit more of a complicated time in John Wick 2. 3 didn't seem to want to tell us when the characters were doing the right thing. One of my favorite archetypes is sort of the sad dad. I think Song of the Sea has the best sad dad ever. It is someone who is just trying to do right by what they know, but is so often the antagonist, at least for part of the story, because they don't know the whole story, and so the actions that they take go against sort of what good they could be doing. In Song of the Sea, the sad dad throws a chest into the ocean that we know we need the chest in order to get an object that's in the chest in order to solve all the problems, but the dad just thinks the presence of the chest is the problem and throws it into the sea. We have someone who very clearly is trying to do right by what they know, but doesn't know all of the information. I think Halle Berry's character is really close to that. She's a sad mom character. I can't wait to see more of her. The dog action scenes are great, and her character development was great and concise, and by building off of the empathy we have for John. Halle Berry has 2 dogs, asks John, "Are you a dog person?" in what didn't feel like an egregious nod to the audience, but was just sort of tactfully enough written in. John helped Halle Berry get her daughter out, essentially. And she now just doesn't know where the daughter is, doesn't know anything about the daughter, but still is having to live in the life of the assassins. When we first meet her, we are getting sort of very mixed messages where we are building empathy with someone who we understand why they're doing the things they're doing because we've seen John in a very similar position. In fact, we saw John in the same position last movie where he was asked to fulfill a blood oath when he was out and trying to remain out and just sort of under. Blood oaths, the blood oaths, do the fingerprint thing. And here we have John coming in to ask for someone to return the favor. And, you know, we are rooting for our protagonist, John Wick, to, you know, succeed in using the tools that are available to him to, you know, further his goals. Being contrasted with someone who is being compared to John Wick and going through the same struggles that we have seen John Wick have to go through and just having a much harder time of it. And John not making that any bit easier. And so the movie doesn't quite know how to frame these two characters in this particular interaction. As soon as this interaction is completed, then it knows how to frame them because they're both on the same side. But this is a place where we as the audience know that these blood oaths used in this particular way is kind of bullshit. It's what got John Wick excommunicado in the end because someone was using it to do a thing that wasn't allowed by the rules, but John Wick still had to do it because that's what the thing says to do with someone who we don't want more bad things even to happen to. I'll say with the hint, the promise that this is a character who will get both more development and more resolution in the future. Everything's going to happen in the future. But in the meantime, we have a very good action movie with, I'll say, a much better onboarding than 2 had. And my voice is starting to go. So I think I'm going to wrap it up about there. Thanks for joining me. If there's anything, threads that I lost, anything more you want to talk about, hit me up in the comments, follow me on Twitter, I'm at dboyfajardo, or hit me up on Patreon, patreon.com/dboyfajardo. Links to that will also be in the Dooblydoo right on top. I'm out of college now, help me get paid. I'm still sick, and it's very late, so I'll see you later. Is this good TV?